This is our third MESA-DER workshop of this year, which is cybersecurity for MESA-DER, which is becoming IEEE 1815.2. Just for your information, I would ask you to hold your questions until the end, but you can put them in the chat. And if they go in the chat, we'll try to answer them at the end of the session, because with a workshop like this, we try to get through the material and get to the questions later on. I'm going to start with the contents, which is, we're first going to have just a brief introduction to MESA and who and what MESA Alliance is and MESA-DER. Then we'll cover cybersecurity concepts. So these are at the high level. Most people, I suspect, are not real cybersecurity experts. Maybe a few of you are. But what I'd like to do is just kind of cover the concepts and then get into some of the work that's been going on in cybersecurity, including the NIST cybersecurity framework, the IEEE 1547.3, which is cybersecurity guidelines and recommendations for distributed energy resources. And then we will get to the cybersecurity for the DNP3 protocol specifically, because that's what MESA is based on. And then we will have the question time. So I'm just going to start with the introduction of MESA. MESA Alliance is an industry association comprised of electric utilities and technology suppliers, and we're dedicated to providing interoperable communications for DER systems and DER devices. So we do have a number of members. This is our current member list, or at least most of them. As you can see, there is quite a mix of both utilities as well as vendors of DER systems and a number of other folks that are involved very heavily in this arena. So what is our mission? Our mission is to accelerate the interconnection of DER through the development of interoperable communication specifications. That's a very important word, interoperable, because we absolutely feel that the only way for DER to become widely available to be interconnected with the capability to help manage the grid or help provide DER type grid support is through interoperability. And so our focus right from the beginning, many years ago now, is to use the DNP3 protocol, which most utilities use for SCADA-like interactions. And we combined it with the IEC 61850 7420 data models. And with that, DNP3 becomes interoperable because the same DNP3 data points then can be used across the board and mean the same thing to the utilities, to the DERs, et cetera. So it's creating a common language. And the 61857-420 data models provides the functionality needed for IEEE 1547, as well as IEEE 2800 and energy storage systems, because one of our main focuses was, again, on particularly the larger energy storage systems. So this is another way of looking at what the MESA specification is. And As you can see from this drawing, we have the utility or the aggregator, and they'll have a SCADA system and or some kind of DER energy management system. And then they can use the DNP3 protocol, just as they do now to manage substations, but now using the 61850 data model for interoperability to talk to, let's say, a plant or the larger DER systems, or it could be smaller ones. Our main focus in the beginning was the larger ones because those are the ones that the utilities are actively interacting with, but it could be the smaller ones as well as it becomes more useful to have a 61850 and DNP3 based communications. MESA also has device specifications. I'm not going to go into those today, but I just wanted to make it clear that indeed we've tried to go the whole route of having not only the higher level areas covered in our interoperability, but also in the device level. And that's where we're using what we call MESA SunSpec data model. One of the things that we needed to be clear on when we were developing this model was that we're talking about a complex architecture, a complex environment. We are not talking just about, say, a single DER storage system controller with a battery. We can talk about that with a link maybe even to the TSO transmission company or the distribution company. But we're also recognizing that there are facilities. So the blue area is the facilities, and the facilities where the DERs are all located, and there can be storage, diesel generators, PV systems, electric vehicles as well. They all may be managed by facilities, energy management systems, and even up to the microgrid or plant levels that manage, say, a whole site and not just, say, a building or something. We also recognize that there are aggregators as well as the distribution utility and others. And at the top, these are the markets. The markets are beginning to drive a lot of what happens. So we recognized we needed to take all of that into account. And this, again, I won't go through it in detail because it's just sort of historical, but I think it's important to recognize that we took 61850, we took DNP3, this blue. We originally created a preliminary specification, but eventually created this DNP3 application note 2018. What we're now doing is we're taking this to the standardization level. So here it was really just a document. Now we're taking it to become IEEE 1815.2. I think making it a standard will allow it to be used much more easily by different groups. And in fact, we even have a spreadsheet which will make it easier to actually implement it. It's not just a PDF file with a lot of words on it. It's actually a spreadsheet with the details of the data points included. So what functions have we included? We've included the 1547 functions as spelled out in the 1547.1. We also have added a number of functions that are in 61850, but are not included in 1547 yet. We'll see what happens. But I think it's important to recognize that there are additional functions. And I'll just point out one of them, which is scheduling, because scheduling has become quite a bit more important as we try to manage the grid and the export of power and the import of load. So scheduling those capabilities has become quite a bit more important. And so MESA and the DNP3 can provide quite sophisticated scheduling capabilities. So this is, again, another look at this. One of the things we're doing at the same time as turning IEEE, MESA-DER into IEEE 1815.2 is to also provide testing and certification process. We have made an agreement with UL that they would manage the testing and certification. We take it that they will be using it to test DER plants, as you know, plant systems, plant control systems, not just the DER devices, but basically to 1547.1, UL 1741 SB, and maybe in the future 1741 SE for power control systems and scheduling. So that is now underway. We have this now well-established agreement with UL to do that. It will then be MESA certified once a system has gone through the testing. And we're also looking at additional possible testing for the SunSpec Modbus, so within the plant. Okay, let's move on to cybersecurity concepts. Cybersecurity is not always well understood or even appreciated, except in the abstract. I want to make sure I'm secure. So it's important to set the stage of what can be done at this point, what is being done, and where things are still out in the wild, wild west. So first of all, cybersecurity includes the threats and the attack vectors. You know, what are the cybersecurity threats? Because these are the kinds of things that are needed to be protected. So for instance, confidentiality, that means, you know, make sure it's kept secret if it needs to be. Integrity, the data is not changed. Availability, that you can get the message through if you need to have it sent or received. And accountability, where you're saying, well, let's make sure that if it did get received, and if it got received, that the other side doesn't say it didn't get it, or that in fact it didn't get it, and that has to be taken into account. So for DER, it's probably integrity and availability is the most important from a operational perspective. If you're talking financial sides, confidentiality and accountability will also be very, very important. So there are 5 key concepts that I think are quite important. And the first one is resilience. So resilience really means not that you won't be attacked or that the attacker doesn't get through somehow, but that you can minimize the impacts. So you can minimize them first by sort of identifying what you need to protect, doing risk assessment for your assets, then putting in prevention. And prevention can be technologies, but it also can be procedures that humans have to follow. But equally important to resilience is the ability to detect something that's occurring and to respond to it in some kind of appropriate way so that you can mitigate the problems that you're facing. And then you have to be able to recover. So it's important to see that resilience is really the name of the game, not just protecting yourself, because you're always going to be have somebody get through with an attack. So you've got to be more resilient. The other thing that is really important is security by design. This really means put in the security right from the beginning. Don't just say, oh, I'm going to add it on later on. I'm going to throw in a password for some kind of protection. That's not good enough. So security by design is really an important approach. You have to say right from the beginning, I'm going to put in this kind of security, or I'm going to require this kind of security if you're purchasing it from another system or allowing a DER to interconnect. Third concept is that IT, information technology, and OT, operational technologies, are similar but different. And it's important to be able to use the capabilities of IT, but recognize that we're working in OT environments. Then the next concept is risk assessment. Risk is really how you determine what needs to be protected. If it's not particularly sensitive information, or, then you can have it at a lower level of security. But if it's really high risk exposure, safety issues, functional issues, environmental, societal, all of these other things, those have to be taken into account. And that helps you determine what you need to protect and how much you need to protect it. And concept number 5 is really cybersecurity standards should be used, including best practices, because it's not a good idea to invent your own. So again, as I mentioned, risk assessment is kind of the key. It's sort of the center of this disk, where you'll have security organizational issues. They'll say, you shall have security policies, you shall have training, there will be audits, etc. But there are also security procedures, notification of problems, plans for coping with things. Who should do what first, and what should happen next, and who does what. Very important. It's not just technologies, it's the procedures that you must use. And then a third of it is the technologies that might be used, such as role-based access control, authentication, authorization, logging, hardening of the equipment and the networks, etc. So it's really important to go through this whole risk assessment process to understand what needs to be done. Okay, I mentioned cybersecurity standards and guidelines. And in particular, I like this diagram here because what it does is it shows that there are differences between certain types of cybersecurity standards. This group here, organizational, are what I call what standards. And what standards say you should do this or you must do that, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. It just simply says you must be able to do it, and that's what this requirement is all about. So those are the what standards. There are then technical how standards, and the internet has plenty of these as what you could use. There's also IEC 62351, which provides a lot of how standards. How do you do key management? How do you do access control, etc. And then there are additional some IEEE standards, some other IEC standards for providing how to do it. And you'll see that listed down here is also IEEE 1815, SA version 5 and version 6 for DNP protocol. Andrew West will get into this in a lot more detail later on. But as you can see, it's important to have this what and how. And then the third or fourth column, but the third process is the process towards compliance, which is the testing and certification process. It's one thing to say what you want to do and then how you want to do it, but you've also got to test it and get it certified. So this is also the areas that are really important. And then just looking at this area of focus, it's sort of, we've got the general IT area, which I've shown as being purple. There's a lot of commonality across different industries. But then with the yellow, we're zoning in on the energy systems, environmental or operational environment. And then with the blue, the really detailed operational technologies. So this is quite important to sort of see that there is a progression of how focused they are on particular areas. There are also federal and state cybersecurity requirements that are, well, beginning to be developed mostly at a very high level. And so I won't go into details, but just recognize that there are efforts to say cybersecurity for the electric power industry is really important, defending critical infrastructure. And DOE has some efforts going on with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. California laws has some issues, some items. We also have some private, well, public-private efforts. We have the CPUC in California doing the smart inverter operationalization cybersecurity subgroup, where we're working on trying to develop a phased approach to cybersecurity requirements. SunSpec has cybersecurity certification process underway. UL has UL 2941 called an outline of investigation for cybersecurity for DER and IBR, the inverter-based resources, as well as IEC 62351 has a lot of testing requirements for the 62351 series of standards. So it's really important to recognize that there is now the testing for those requirements. And DNP Users Group has testing beginning to be set up for DNP SAV5 and soon SAV6 as soon as that's finalized. Okay, one of the more important efforts has been the NIST cybersecurity framework. What's important about this is it established sort of a common language or a common framework for discussing all of the different things that you need to do. And you will notice here that you have sort of the things I mentioned under resilience. You have to identify your assets. You have to do a risk assessment, and then you can protect your assets, including training and other things. You have to detect any problems. You have to respond to those problems, and you have to recover. So this is an important framework that can be used by, and is being used, in fact, by multiple efforts. And it includes crosswalks, which it says which cybersecurity standards are providing, for instance, data security and addressing those issues. So it's a very good high-level framework from which other requirements can be made. Then there is one of the efforts that's gone on recently is IEEE 1547.3, which is a guide for cybersecurity of distributed energy resources interconnected with the electric power systems. It has gone through all of the balloting and is now in the hands of the IEEE to do the final whatever it is that IEEE does, but it should be published fairly shortly, certainly by the end of this year, hopefully in Q3, and so that it will become then a standard as a guide. It's got recommendations, not shall statements, but recommendations for cybersecurity, for DER cybersecurity. I'm going to go through it sort of briefly to show what's included in this standard, because again, it goes sort of one level more than the NIST cybersecurity framework by trying to provide very specific types of recommendations. So first, there's an informative section that really covers many of the kinds of things that I've just been covering in these slides. But it's important to set the stage so that people can understand what makes sense for the situation that they're in. It's not good enough to just say, oh, here's a laundry list of things you should do. It's really a question of how, what needs to be done, when do you do it, what are the issues that you need to address. So this is covered in this informative section. One of the important aspects, if you'll notice that this is a 1547 type document, is 1547 base standard really only included requirements for communications in this tiny little blue area, what they call the local DER interface. And the rest of it is out of scope for 1547. However, cybersecurity has to be end-to-end. You can't just say, oh, this little blue piece is secure, but the rest of it is not, because you can send malware quite securely through this interface, and it'll still be malware on the other side. So one of the things that we did in 1547.3 was to say that our scope is really this larger area, the sort of from end to end. And that, I think, is an important aspect. One of the things that's also going on just now is this ongoing debate on the scope of IEEE 1547.10, which is a new effort on gateways. And the gateways will need to include cybersecurity requirements of some form or another, but it's still early and we don't know where it's going. But if anyone's interested, this is an ongoing area where presumably we'll cover at least part of the cybersecurity if you're talking about, say, gateways for the DER environment. So another way of looking at this is that we can have the utilities here on the left with their SCADA systems and their energy management systems, maybe their ADMS and DERM systems, as well as their market aspects. And they're going to need to communicate either directly, if this is a big DER, the larger DER for grid support might be an IBR, not just a DER. In other words, it's transmission connected, not just distribution connected. And there can be real-time communications, particularly with DNP3, maybe also with 61850. But you need security on both ends. The same is true with these gateways, utility gateways to aggregator gateways, as well as utility gateways to facility gateways. Because within the aggregator and within the facilities, there are going to be more and more sophisticated capabilities to manage the DERs and the loads I think that's going to be quite important. And so there will also need to be cybersecurity, these green areas, just even within the facility, and certainly between the aggregator and the DERs that they're responsible for. So this sort of shows the cybersecurity architectures for information exchanges. So this is just one aspect. That's the communication aspect. Okay, Clause 5 of 1547.3 are really the recommendations. And here we went through and said, okay, there are really important recommendations. And we started with the risk assessment and management. Then we had communication network engineering. It's not just the DER devices themselves. It's also the communication networks that are used to interconnect or interact with all of these DERs. And so we covered those networks, including traffic monitoring, physical access, as well as cloud computing, because that's becoming more and more important. We also addressed access control, including role-based access control, which is a quite complex process. And then there's also data security. This is pretty traditional data at rest, but also data in transit. And data in transit, of course, is where we're talking communication protocols. And we have, in fact, a comparison in there of the key DER protocol security. Then we also cover security management, including patch management, etc. And then a section on coping with and recovering from security events. And that is pretty important as well. One of the things that I think is important in the risk area, sort of jumping back up here to the risk, is having interorganizational agreements where you define who does what and who provides which information to whom. If you're within an organization, it can be sort of the CEO or, you know, the security person in charge who will just say, okay, you do this, you do that, and we'll do this other. But when you have DER, these are different organizations. So you have the utility, you have the aggregator, you have the DER site owner operator, you have the vendor of the equipment who may still be actively involved in it. All of these need to have an agreement that tells them who does what when, particularly when there is some kind of attack. So it's really important to include that. What I've done here is, and I won't go through this, but you can look at it at your leisure, is for an example of the NIST cybersecurity framework items that are appropriate for access control recommendations. So we picked up on those and said, this has to is applicable to the access control recommendations. And then we went through and said, okay, and what are our access control recommendations? And this is an example, just an overview of a few of them, because we have quite a lot. And where we show the necessary recommendations and the optional recommendations. And so, for instance, access control, authentication, user authorization. What is the user allowed to do if they get onto the system? As well as user accountability and non-repudiation. If a user did something, it should get logged so that it's traceable back to that user. And then we have some more sophisticated issue items, recommendations under the optional recommendations. So one thing that we have done in the California Public Utilities Commission is we're working on developing some basic cybersecurity requirements. So remember 1547.3 is recommendations only. What we're trying to do is to develop a set of basic cybersecurity requirements. And so what we've done is we've taken some of the key items from 1547.3 and changed the wording. For instance, authentication is not just is, it's shall be protected with authentication mechanism. And so turning these into shalls. Now, not all of what's in 1547.3 should be or ought to be turned into shalls, but this is what we're going through, and it can be a little hairy, but we're trying to work on it. We also in 1547.3 have some annexes. Just point out we have descriptions of some of the key protocols, as well as some of the other types of protocols that are not as related to DER. And we also have a list and descriptions of cybersecurity standards. So I think this could be of interest if you just want to understand what a particular cybersecurity standard is all about. And then we also have an expansion of the NIST cybersecurity framework to really show how it might be used. So I'm going to just show an example of this. So this is in Annex E, as I mentioned. And here's an example. Here's the subcategory, data at rest is protected. There's a justification. This comes from NIST. Then we added in, what is it, for instance, that the grid operators need to do with respect to this requirement? What is it that the DER facility owner operators need to do? What about the aggregators? What about the vendors? And then there's this reference to cybersecurity standards. I remember I mentioned the crosswalks. And so we've added those in, or NIST did actually, including the NERC SIPs, which I think is important, even though it's not directly related to DER. And so we did this actually for each one of the NIST cybersecurity framework items. So we're trying to get an understanding of who's responsible, who needs to do what in order to meet the cybersecurity requirements. We did this also in another way where we have in Annex F these engineering strategies for the manufacturer, which is different often from the cybersecurity recommendations. So again, these are just sort of responsibility for the particular roles, because we wanted to be clear that sometimes cybersecurity can be handled by engineering strategies, redundancy, for instance, rather than always talking about cryptography and passwords and so forth. So I think it's important to recognize that it's a combination of engineering and cyber that will make things safer. So I am now going to turn this over to Andrew West and let him pick up on the DNP3 cybersecurity. So Andrew, go for it.
Thank you, Francis. I'm going to turn off my camera just to save bandwidth in case that impacts the audio, and I'll see you again at question time. So I'm going to be looking at particularly some of the internal characteristics of the cybersecurity features of DNP, which are the underpinnings for 1815.2 and the DER communications that operate over DNP. So moving forward, please, Francis. So the focus of this is some of the technical aspects. Now, in the material that Francis has already spoken about, there's been a number of looking at the policies and frameworks and guidelines and recommendations and so forth. So once we get down to looking at this element of cybersecurity for the protocol, we're now looking at some of the tools that can be used to implement the policies. So one thing you need, at least I would recommend that you consider, is that this comes down to having some things in the toolkit to provide you a way of doing something. It's not the only correct answer, but when we get down to technologies and standards, if we want to have interoperability between equipment, we have to support the same ways of doing things so that they will work together. So part of that is why 1547.3 is recommending the use of DNP secure authentication, which I'm about to talk about, as the way of securing DNP communication. So the area of focus within this toolkit is looking at the specific requirements for the security of the communication in the operational technology space. So again, as Francis has already discussed, availability of the communication is critical. So we want to ensure that we have control over the system and are communicating the information. The integrity of the information is what is largely managed by the cybersecurity features. So what we're looking at here is to verify that the message is received from a trusted source and that it has not been spoofed, or an attacker has not pretended to be the source of the information and crafted some malware which is being passed on. We're also verifying that the message has not been tampered with in transmission, so that it has come from the trusted source and has not been modified in any way. And we're also verifying that the message has not come from a trusted source and been copied and recorded and then later replayed in order for a malicious actor to cause an action that was previously authorized to be repeated at a later time. So those are some of the integrity features supported by this technology. And of course, we are focused within the DNP community on the execution efficiency. So when we first began rolling out DNP3 as secure authentication, we were concerned about the impact on the capability of devices to implement the software and to execute the software. And at the time when we began this work, a lot of the algorithms that we used took a lot of process overhead, and we were quite concerned not to take actions or recommend anything that was too onerous for the devices. So that's what we're focused on here. Also, just to highlight, this area of DNP is based on and was developed in parallel with the IEEE 62351 Part 5 section. 62351 is the section of the IEEE standards that talk about security for communication of the power grid operation. So in fact, we have the same editor was involved in both DNP and the 62351 in the first stages. Next slide, please, Francis. Okay, so what some of the things that we've been particularly focused on, I've mentioned already that we were concerned about the capability of low power devices to support cybersecurity cryptographic software. One of the features of some SCADA networks and the communication across them is that we have the potential for mixed media. So we could be able to transport DNP3 across any media. It could be serial, it could be Ethernet, or it could be a mixed system that goes serial to radio, across to a radio receiver, and then Ethernet over a part, and then converted back to serial, or so on. So we have to have the end-to-end security across whatever that media is. And Francis alluded to this as needing to consider end-to-end security across the whole system and not just the parts in the middle. Also, this technology is appropriate for isolated networks. So it does not need access to corporate IT for management using standard IT security management tools. It's intended to run on isolated networks. And it provides DNP application to DNP application authentication. So one of the questions we get asked is, for example, why not just use VPN routers between devices? Or why not just use TLS between devices? And sometimes the answer is, well, if you're running over a link that has any serial element, you can't use TLS. TLS will work between a pair of devices that run over Ethernet. If you're deciding to deploy VPN routers and then you plug a plain text DNP device into the router, you've secured the network communication that there's a plain text link at each end of it. And if an attacker could gain access to the site, they could connect in on that plain text link, for example. And then again, as Francis alluded to before, that would give you access to the network. It might be secure encrypted access, but it's access nonetheless. So there's various different things we were considering in this. Next, please. So unfortunately, that image has gone over the text. Never mind. The basic concept here that's used within DNP secure authentication, and is also the underlying concept that's used in most of the other technologies, such as TLS, is the idea of having a code. Well, one of the concepts that's used, and the one that we are using, is a message authentication code, which is added to a message. And the basic process by which this is done is fairly lightweight, which is one of the important criteria. We have the message that's going to be transmitted, which is the orange part shown there. Each end of the link has a secret key, if you like. If you want to think of it, it's like a password, but it's kept secret at each end. And an algorithm known as a hashing algorithm is run across the data in the key and in the message to form this thing called the message authentication code. So the characteristics of this hashing function are that any change of the message or the key makes a significant change in the MAC, so that it's very difficult to create a message with a specific MAC value to spoof a message that will match the key at the receiving end. It's very sensitive to any changes in the message and so forth. And the idea is that each end of the link knows the secret. So we have established the security trust by having pre-established some information that both ends agree on. Then we can transmit the message and the MAC. The receiving device can also run the same algorithm, the same hashing algorithm across their copy of the key and the message, and compare the result with the MAC they received. And if the MACs match, they know that the sending device has the same secret key and that the message has not been interfered with in transit, so not been tampered with. So they can verify the source, they can verify that the message was transferred safely. And we also include some mechanisms in the process, including a message sequence number, so that even if you repeat the same message payload, there's some other information that gets updated on every transmission so that the receiver can identify if it's a replay of a previously received message. And that way we can reject that recording and replay attack. So for this to work, we have this symmetric update key. This key that's used for the hash function is called a session key. And that session key gets automatically renegotiated by the machines. And it's renegotiated and refreshed fast enough that it is never, it's always changing faster than the sequence number in the message ID is going to roll over. So there's never a repetition of a message. And that is one of the configuration parameters, is how frequently you update the session key, either by the count of messages that have been secured or by a elapsed time window. So the kinds of numbers we're talking about here, it might be that you have the session key change every 15 minutes or every couple of thousand messages or thereabouts. To manage that process of changing the session key, the devices at each end have been pre-configured with an update key or have an update key. So when we first released DNP Secure Authentication, it used a pre-shared update key, which was loaded into the devices at both ends of the systems. And that update key was used by a cryptographic process to control and share the session keys between the two ends using a standard cryptographic mechanism for doing that. So as Francis has mentioned before, when you're doing cybersecurity, you don't create your own mechanisms. You use standard ways of doing things. And so this process with the HMAC for verification of a message is a standard authentication process for cybersecurity. And there are standard algorithms used for doing this. And there are standard algorithms for doing the session key update. And those algorithms ensure that the session key exchange is done in an encrypted manner, so that even if you're eavesdropping on the communication at the time when the keys are exchanged, the keys are still kept secret. So that's the fundamental process that's used at the lowest level to secure and authenticate the exchange between the devices for the DNP payload. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history on this. We first released DNP Secure Authentication in 2007, and there were some minor revisions to provide version 2, and that was included in the IEEE 1815-2010 release, which was where DNP3 became released as a standard. And so SAV2 used this idea of having pre-shared symmetric update keys as the mechanism for establishing the trust between the two devices that are communicating with each other. We kept developing DNP3 secure authentication over the next few years, and the aim was to provide a mechanism to be able to remotely distribute the update keys. So with the pre-shared mechanism in SAV2, you're essentially establishing the keys at configuration time. And for a lot of systems, you install them in the field and you never change them. And that, in my mind, that gives you pretty good security, unless you know that those keys have been compromised somehow, which is possible because at some point humans get involved in installing the keys. But from a cryptographic point of view and the amount of computational power required to reverse engineer what those keys are, they're secure for quite a long time. But we recognize that for deployment at scale, it's appropriate to have a mechanism to remotely deploy keys or change the keys in devices. And so that's what was basically added with SAV5. The underlying mechanism I spoke about before with the cryptographic hash to authenticate the messages remained the same, but we added a mechanism for distributing the update keys. So that was released in 2012 in the update to IEEE 1815, and that is still the current version of the 1815 specification to DNP3 and the current release of secure authentication. What we've been working on since then is secure authentication version 6, which is a radical change to how we do security. The underlying mechanism of the hashing to authenticate the messages is remaining the same, but rather than relying on installing these symmetric update keys, we're having a different process where no human ever manages keys. And we don't distribute keys between devices. We allow the keys to be negotiated between the devices, and instead we impose a new mechanism to authorize the communication between pairs of devices. And so there's a bit of new terminology being developed to describe this, but it's a completely different way of establishing the trust between the devices, and it simplifies the use of that for the utilities or the end users and the system operators and owners. So this is what's coming out next in the next release of 1815, which is due mid-2025, let's say. It might be a bit earlier, but definitely by the end of 2025. The other thing that we're adding in SAV6 is we're going to add an option for confidentiality or encryption of the payload data for those applications that do need security or secrecy of the actual communication data. And that's a new feature, and we basically that's been enabled by some of the recent advances in cryptographic algorithms that are much more efficient computationally. Plus, we also recognize that devices are becoming more computationally powerful and have more scope to do these things. So the underlying mechanism in SAV6 is relying on a public key infrastructure kinds of process. So it's a move away from the distribution of symmetric keys that we've relied on in SAV2 and SAV5. Next, please.
So, Andrew, just a note, we've got about 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thank you very much for that. So I want to just talk about SAV6 and its associated management protocol very briefly, because they are still future-aware, but this is what's coming. So previously SAV2 and SAV5 were part of the application layer for DMP and were baked in with configuration. With the new version SAV6, we're putting in a separate security layer between the DMP transport and DMP application. And the authorization and management protocol is going to be a separate protocol that can pass information about managing and controlling the security features, and including supporting adding role-based access control. And that can be transported across the DMP transport, but is handled separately, and it then controls the DMP communication to the application layer. And next, please. So the final diagram here basically shows where these things operate. Obviously, DMP secure authentication operates between the DMP master station and either the gateways or the outstations. And if you have a hierarchical system, it can be between the gateway and the further outstations. The AMP protocol operates between what we're calling the DMP authority, which is the system that authorizes which masters can talk to which outstations and can distribute that information through the first connected master through to each of the outstations. So the AMP data is passed from the authority over an internet protocol to the DMP masters, and thereafter the AMP payload is passed as in DMP messages down to the various devices. But it has signatures that allow every device to verify that the message came from the authority and that has not been tampered with, etc. And separately from this, the authority can connect into the corporate enterprise credential management or certificate authorities and so forth, so that we can establish a full chain of trust. And that full chain of trust is verified by all of the devices. So this is a very different way of handling the authorization of communication. And at no time here are we distributing keys between devices. We're just establishing permission for devices and authorizing them to communicate. So that's the basic premise behind that. And the last slide, please. Okay, so the basic functionality in DMP through secure authentication has not changed since the beginning. It's basically authenticating every message and in a way that you can verify that it comes from the authorized source, has not been tampered with. With the new version, MESA-DER, we're going to significantly simplify the deployment by eliminating the key management aspect of that. And it's coupled with introducing optionally the use of the authorization management protocol. But if you have an authority using the AMP protocol, it allows you to do remote management. But even if you don't have the authority, we still have an installation and enrollment procedure with MESA-DER that allows a human to authorize the communication between pairs of devices. It's just that AMP gives you more capability to manage that remotely. So SAV2 and SAV5, they're available right now. They've been used in the field. And you can use them with these pre-configured update keys. And I would recommend installing those keys and don't change them. But make sure the process you use for installing those keys keeps the key value secure and secret. So that's it from me, the quick overview of the technology involved in secure authentication.
Okay, thank you. There is a membership slide here where you can join MESA, and if you want to get in on the ground floor of being certified to DNP3 and MESA 1815.2, this will help with that. I apologize, we've run a little bit over. We have received a number of questions. I think what we will probably try to do is just respond by email to these questions, because I think that I want to respect people's time, and I know we've run over a little bit, but we will capture all of the questions, and we will definitely respond to you. So I thank you very much for joining us. The slides will be made available as well, and as well we will provide the recorded session as well as the slides. So I thank you very much for joining, and hopefully see you at our next workshop, which will be next week. So thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you.